I started recording and I'll start letting people in, Samantha, so just 1 second.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'll give you a minute to, get your sound and cameras working, but hopefully you can all hear me and see Bianca and I over here. Good, perfect. I'll take that thumbs up from Paul. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Samantha Hooker, and I'll be the moderator for today's Eval Cafe. The cafe is a longstanding speaker series. It's hosted by the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And the goal of the series is to encourage a deeper dive into all things evaluation. We always like to start our cafes by taking a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, recognizing that Western Michigan University is located on lands historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. We are excited today to be joined by Dr. Bianca Montrosse-Moorhead, an expert in evaluation. She currently serves as an associate professor of evaluation at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Montrosse-Moorhead has published extensively in evaluation and is the co-editor-in-chief for New Directions for Evaluation. As PI or co-PI, she has written proposals to secure more than $18 million in total project funding. She's a founding member and former chair of the Eval Youth Global Network and has served a 3-year term as an AEA board member. With Khalil Bitar, Bianca is a co-author of a chapter in Core Concepts in Evaluation, Classic Writings and Contemporary Commentary, which was edited by Lori Wingate, Lissa Wilson-Betcho, and Kelly Robertson here at the Evaluation Center, and Aisha Boyce at Arizona State University. We do have a pretty large audience joining us today, which is great. So to ask a question, if you want to use the Zoom reaction button to raise your hand, we can do that. If you would rather post your question in the comments, that works as well. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Bianca.
Thanks, Samantha. I appreciate that. So let me get myself set up so I can see all the windows. Be helpful. All right. Samantha, can you see my screen? Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the really lovely introduction, Samantha. And also thank you for giving me an opportunity to give an Evaluation Cafe talk. I'm a big fan of the Evaluation Center and the Evaluation Cafe talks, and so it's a real honor to be here today. So thanks for that. So this talk that I'm going to give today is based on a chapter, as Samantha mentioned, in a book that's coming out. This is a chapter that I co-authored with Khalil Bitar. And although I'm the one who's up here and talking, let me say that this chapter was very much a collaborative and joint effort. So the other thing I'll say is one of my graduate students, who I really adore, saw the ad for this and read the title and just sort of looked at me and was like, "What are you talking about?" So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll get a sense of why I named it the way that I did. So, all right. So the first thing I want to do is talk about how this chapter came to be, because it's very much related to who I am as an evaluation researcher and teacher and practitioner. And I will say there's several paths that I've traveled that have led me to write this chapter with Khalil. So I'm going to start at the beginning. All right, so my dad, who you see on the top left photo, immigrated to the United States when he was 18 from Italy. He spoke no English. He met my mom, who's also in the photo, about a year later, and they've been together ever since. They had me, and you see me as a little kid in this photo. They eventually moved to South Carolina, where I grew up, and they opened an Italian restaurant. They still own that restaurant. You see a photo of it there. And while they were and continue to be incredibly supportive of me, I will say that neither of them went to college. And so what that means is that I was a first generation college student. I eventually found my way to Claremont Graduate University to pursue a master's degree and then a PhD with an emphasis in evaluation and applied research methods. While at Claremont, I studied or worked with folks whose names you might recognize. So Michael Scriven was one, Stuart Donaldson, Hallie Preskill, and Marv Alkin. My doctoral advisor was Tina Christie, who is still a great friend and mentor today. And at Claremont, we could take courses outside of evaluation and research methods. And I actually decided to do that. So I ended up taking several cultural studies courses, which was the place for the first time that I started to get introduced to writings outside of evaluation that were on ideas like privilege and power and identity and those kinds of things. As Samantha mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently an associate professor in the Research Methods Measurement and Evaluation program at UConn. We joke that I'm the E in Army. We say Army for short because I'm like the evaluation person. And so here I mentor others to do research and evaluation studies. I do evaluation, so I have an active evaluation practice. And I study evaluation through my research. In that role, or in my role as a faculty member, I've also had the privilege of having time to serve in a number of leadership roles in evaluation. One of those was helping to found the Eval Youth Global Network. You see a photo of the founding members on the top right-hand side of your screen. Interestingly, which I didn't actually recognize till I started putting this talk together, that Khalil and I are standing next to each other in this photo. Look for the yellow square, even though we had only just met in Nepal. So, clearly, fate was already starting to bring us together to work. So why am I telling you all this, and how does this relate to the chapter that I'm writing, that we wrote? So a couple of things. One, I don't think it's a coincidence that I jumped at the opportunity to attend a meeting in Nepal, to be a part of a movement and evaluation that at that time was just getting underway related to young and emerging evaluators. My experience as a first generation college student taught me how hard it could be to navigate educational spaces and to begin to work toward building a career. I've never forgotten that lesson, and it is one that shapes how I show up as an evaluation teacher and the advocacy work that I continue to do related to young and emerging evaluators, both with and without Khalil. Two, growing up in a restaurant taught me something that I don't know that I could have ever learned in school, and certainly couldn't have learned as early as I did. So I spent the first 18 years of my life literally meeting new people every day from every walk of life. And so I learned from a really young age how to talk with people and and I was interested in what they had to say. And so I met people who looked like me, who didn't look like me, who shared identities that I had, didn't share identities that I have, right? And so what I began to sort of understand at an early age, although I don't know that I would have sort of talked about it in the way that I talk about it now, right? Experience gives us sort of a way to make sense of these things. Is that the more people that I met, the bigger the world got for me. And the bigger the world got for me, the more I became aware of my own place in the world and how much of the world I had yet to know and really sort of understand, right? And so that, coupled with my own cultural identity, I identify culturally as Italian. This should come as no surprise. I don't think it's a coincidence that I took cultural studies courses in graduate school. And so my awareness of things like culture and power and privilege and identities and all of those things show up in my work as an evaluation researcher, as a teacher, and a practitioner. And they have connections, to all of this work that I do. The last thing I'll sort of mention is that it really was pure luck that I ended up at Claremont to study evaluation. I had like a little bit of inkling of what evaluation was when I showed up there, but I didn't know anyone, and I certainly didn't know the people that I'd be studying and working with. And the folks I met there, the classes I took, the evaluations I worked on, they all strongly shaped, and quite honestly, in lots of ways, continue to shape my scholarly contributions to evaluation. One person in particular is Michael Scriven. I suspect all of you have heard that name, which brings me to the present chapter. All right, so in 2002, it got announced that this book was coming out. And you see a portion of the open call on the left-hand side of your screen. And the intent of the book was to include classical influential evaluation writing and to pair them with new chapters that provide commentary on those writings. And there are 5 classic writings that Lori and Aisha and Lissa and Kelly identified. The first of which is Michael Scriven's introduction in his Evaluation Thesaurus. And in that introduction, he defines evaluation as a distinct form of inquiry that's oriented towards reaching judgments of merit, worth, or significance. So when it came out, I sent Khalil an email with the seed of an idea related to Scriven's definition. You see a portion of that email here. And explained in that email that my thinking about the definition was heavily influenced by my training with Michael, but also by my work with Eval Youth, which he was side by side with me in much of that, and by several other things that I sort of covered in that email. I also told him that I wanted to work with him on this chapter because in some ways, our experiences and knowledge are similar, and in lots of ways, they're distinct. And I think that's a real benefit when we work together. The other thing I noted for him was that we push each other and we're not afraid to sort of challenge each other. And in my opinion, it makes the work that we produce together better. And so I just sort of laid all this out for him. And literally 41 minutes later, because again, I looked, he wrote back and essentially said, I almost sent you the exact same email. I'm in. And so this is actually how Khalil and I came to write this chapter together. And so for the remainder of my time today, I'm going to share with you some of what is included in our forthcoming chapter. All right, in the Evaluation Thesaurus introduction, Scriven verbally sketches out an extended metaphor that he calls the country of the mind. And he argued that this metaphor was really helpful because it helps us locate and draw the boundaries around evaluation, particularly in relation to other disciplines, right? And so in this country of the mind metaphor that he sort of was verbally describing, he talks about, for example, that there's more than one type of discipline. So for example, one can think of standalone disciplines like psychology or geometry, right? For example, and those are clustered in counties that correspond to sort of the subdivision or the theme of sort of knowledge that's getting produced within that county, right? He also argued that there were disciplines that were both standalone disciplines in their own right, but they were also disciplines that served other counties and other disciplines within those counties. And he referred to these types of disciplines as transdisciplines. And it is here that evaluation sits. So for those of you that have read this chapter, you know that this is part of him making the case of not just evaluation as a discipline, but evaluation as a transdiscipline, right? And so Scriven sort of lays this out, right? So while Scriven, again, verbally sort of did this, Khalil and I decided to use this chapter as an opportunity to sketch out visually the country of the mind, right? And so that's one of the things that is in this chapter. Is it's sort of the first time that someone, as far as we know, someone's tried to visualize what he sort of sketched out, right? And the reason I'm showing you it today is because I'm getting ready to walk you through something else that we do in the chapter, which is to amend his definition of evaluation. But I also want to I want you to sort of know that that amended definition still is still situated within the idea that evaluation is a transdiscipline. So evaluation right here is in the county of the utilities, which is sort of in the middle, right? Or this is the county, he calls it the county of transdisciplines, right? And so while he was sketching out sort of the map, right, he also then zoomed in on the evaluation building, right? And he sort of described what happens on each floor and those kinds of things, which I'm going to talk about. But I want to talk about it after I talk about our amended definition, because the definition actually prompted the changes that we made to the building that are included in this chapter. Okay, so first, just to make sure we're all familiar with Scriven's definition, you see it here on the screen, right? Distinct form of inquiry oriented towards reaching judgments. Those judgments are around merit, worth, or significance. Now, having studied with Michael and having read his stuff, I also know he's not the easiest person to read, nor the easiest person to understand. And it often takes sort of reading things a little more than once, I will say, to sort of get it. So I'm going to share with you how I understand some key terms in here, right? Because I think it's helpful then for what I'll do later. So based on my classes with Michael, my conversations with him, my own reading, that kind of stuff, I understand merit generally to be judgments about quality, meaning, and he sort of talked about this in terms of good minus bad, right? And so he actually sketched out for us the kinds of questions one might ask that would fall under merit, right? As an example, we might ask, is this thing we're evaluating good enough to continue implementing? Or compared to things of a similar type, is this thing better than the alternative, right? He would argue those are quality kinds of questions, right? They're questions really that lead to judgments of merit or quality, right? Worth, from his perspective, is really a cost value, a judgment of cost value. And so it includes goodness, which we might get at when we do sort of our merit, our work around merit, right? But it also then adds cost into that, right? And here, cost can be monetary, like how much does it cost, for example, to run a program, right? But it can also include non-monetary costs, like opportunity costs, right? And considerations around that. And so, Michael would say examples of questions you might ask around worth are things like, does what it costs to run this thing justify, is it justified given its quality, right? Or compared with things of a similar type, so maybe we've got something that we're evaluating and there's a couple of different versions of that, which is most cost effective, right? That's another example. In terms of significance, Michael really talked about this as being about importance, right? And that it really comes from a synthesis of merit and worth, but in context and in the evaluation context that the work is occurring, right? And so, for example, questions you might ask that's related to significance could be something like, given that there are no other things of this type within a context, does the importance of this thing outweigh its merit or worth, right? And so like in class, for instance, he talked about an example of like, let's say it doesn't do so well on merit or worth, but it's the only thing of this type here, right? That's important to understand, right? Or, you could ask a question that's like, can this thing be sustained with similar effects in other social, political, or physical contexts, right? So Michael would also say that's a significance kind of question, right? So hopefully you have a little bit better idea of what he means when he talks about merit, worth, or significance. And these are my interpretations of that based on my own experience and my reading of Michael. All right, so with that in mind, Khalil and I proposed our first modification to Scriven's definition, which is to add a fourth type of judgment. And we call this fourth type of judgment value. We did so because, as we argue in the chapter, we think evaluators make other types of judgments that fall outside of the scope of merit, worth, or significance. So what we walk through a couple of examples of things that might fall underneath here. One of which that we highlight in the paper are judgments related to equity. And so, for instance, we draw on work that Khalil has done outside of our work together. We draw from work, for instance, that Geraldine Coffey has been doing around equitable evaluation. We draw from others who are sort of working, and we make it clear how we're defining equity. So in the chapter, we defined equity as judgments of justice or fairness, right? And then, so for evaluations centered on equity, right, it means that the claim being tested is whether the thing we're evaluating is of value because it is equitable or leads to a more equitable state of affairs. So an example of a question you might ask related to this that actually we say wouldn't show up under merit, worth, and significance is something like, to what extent does this thing we are evaluating advance equity? Or compared to other things within a system, is this thing that we're evaluating the right one to influence equity change? And where does it seek to leverage its influence? Right? So these are examples of the kinds of questions we would argue fall under this new fourth judgment type that aren't part of merit, worth, or significance. All right. The second amendment we made was adding ethically informed to his definition. And there were a couple of things that inspired this change. The first is related to what we call little e, or discipline-specific ethics. And so by this, what we're really talking about is the ways in which ethics shows up, for instance, in the professional codes guiding evaluation practice, and thus evaluator conduct, right? So for example, right, the American Evaluation Guiding Principles for Evaluators literally state in the preface, right, that they pertain to the ethical conduct of the evaluator, right? And this is in juxtaposition to, for instance, the standards, right, which are really about evaluation quality, right? That's a different thing, right? There are other codes of conduct that are out there. So another example that we give in the chapter is a code of conduct coming out of Africa called the Indigenous African Ethical Protocol for Evaluations. And that protocol includes this statement: to perform the full implementation of ethical principles when engaging in monitoring and evaluation activities with the African people, with the aim to support monitoring and evaluation practices that respect the rights of the African indigenous peoples and function for their benefit. And if you look at other associations, you will see that there are lots of other examples of ethical codes of conduct produced by them, right? Or by groups involved in evaluation. And all of these codes of conduct, what they're trying to do is sort of say, look, we need to act in accordance with equity, with fairness, with justice, right? And so by adding ethically informed to the definition, we explicitly call attention to the need for professional evaluators to sort of always honor and embody these ethical codes of conduct in practice. We also, although I would say a related caveat is that in the chapter, Khalil and I also point out that not all professional evaluation organizations have ethical codes of conduct. Some just have, for instance, codes about evaluation quality, but not about evaluator conduct. And so in those contexts, there's nothing to call attention to this ethically informed nature of practice, right? And in the worst possible scenario, right, not doing that could lead to evaluations that cause harm, for example, right? So for evaluators working in these contexts, the addition of the phrase ethically informed serves as a reminder and a call to action, right? That this is part of what they have to do, even if their association doesn't have anything explicit, right? Okay, the second reason we added ethically informed is related to what we call big E ethics, or ethics as a transdiscipline. So in the introduction to the Evaluation Thesaurus, Scriven says that ethics can also be understood as a key support discipline that, quote unquote, contributes an element to many evaluations and to much other research. And in that country of the mind map that he was sort of, verbally sketching out and that we gave you a visual for, he includes ethics as another building in the country of the county of the transdisciplines, right? And in fact, he puts it next to evaluation. And so then when you think about the fact that Scriven's, work happened in 1991, and then you think about everything that's come after that, right? All of the evaluation scholarship that's been produced, right? You can see that there's actually been a lot of really smart work done that is, among other things, trying to build stronger connections between the transdiscipline of evaluation and the transdiscipline of ethics. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So there's been work, for instance, that calls attention to evaluation as meeting moral purposes, right? Or sort of grounded in moral purposes. So for instance, the AA guiding principles refer to evaluation as contributing to the common good. That's a moral purpose. Mel Mark talks about evaluation leading to social betterment. That's a moral purpose. Veronica Thomas and Patricia Campbell in their evaluation textbook talk about evaluation needing to, quote, end quote, promote healthy, just, and equitable communities. Again, that's a moral purpose. If we look outside of evaluation, where we know, I'll say evaluation proper, where we know evaluation happens, right? We know evaluation happens in education. We know evaluation happens in personnel evaluation, for instance. We know evaluation happens in products and those kinds of things, right? So if we look even outside and we look in those literature bases, we also see folks trying to make these connections as well. So for instance, there's a lot of literature on ethical judgments in the context of business, right? There's also literature around criteria that one needs to use in evaluating products, and people pushing forward the idea of harm or vulnerability needing to be criteria that are used, right? So regardless of sort of where your work is situated, right, concerns about the moral purposes of evaluation are sort of at the forefront. And so that's one piece to sort of understand about our edition, right? Is that it's drawing on work that is really positioned evaluation as serving some moral purpose. The other piece to understand is that Scriven and others also note that evaluation involves judgment, right? That's why judgment is in the definition. So because there's this judgment piece, right, it also means that evaluation is a normative practice. It involves judgment. When we do evaluations, someone is making a decision, someone is making a judgment about this is good enough or this isn't good enough, or here are the things that need to change, or here are the things that need to be modified, or here's the things you shouldn't change because they're working really well, for instance, right? Someone's making that. Those are normative judgments that are being made, even if we don't call them that, right? And so that's the second piece, right? And so the third piece, when we look across this literature that's been produced since Michael first sort of did this, is work that's been done to try to bring these two pieces together, right? So for instance, Tom Schwant started this early in his career and has continued. And so he's writing, for instance, with Emily Gates now about this, right? Leon Caldwell and Katrina Bloodsoe in their work, both together and separate, are doing some of this as well. And so they've been really helpful in laying out and making the argument that because evaluation is getting centered around some sort of moral purpose, and because it is normative or judgment oriented, it has implications for what our role is as evaluators, right? Because what it does is it positions evaluation practitioners as moral agents engaging in ethically informed inquiry. So this is where, this is the other part for why we added ethically informed to our definition. Now, I will also say that I am well aware, as I suspect you all are too, that there are folks who don't necessarily agree with those sort of premises, right? There are folks who don't believe that evaluation at its core is related to some moral purpose. There are folks who believe that evaluation at its core isn't related to judgment. And if you are in those camps, I'm just going to sort of own it and be open about the fact that you probably aren't finding these arguments very persuasive, right? Because it's not grounded in who you are. But if you believe, like Khalil and I do, that moral purposes are a part of evaluation and that making judgments is part of what happens in an evaluation, then it means you have to begin to consider questions like, what gives evaluators the right to make judgments? How ought those judgments be made? Is what is happening here the right thing to do? And what makes it the right thing to do? Why are evaluators the right people to say this should be done? Right? And so by adding the phrase ethically informed to the definition, Khalil and I are building on and integrating the works that has been done by Tom, by Emily, by Katrina, by Veronica, by Jera, right, to like name a few, right, into evaluation's definition. We are putting this sort of front and center that when you're doing this kind of work, there is an ethical dimension that you have to think about. And you just can't, even though it's not named, like we're just putting it out there. So, all right, so now I've already shared that the evaluation building is in the county of the transdisciplines. And I've also shared that while Michael was sort of verbally sketching out his country of the mind, he also then went on to describe the work that happens at each floor in the evaluation building. So now that I've talked about our amended definition and our proposal for it, I want to describe the building and the changes that Khalil and I made to the building as a result of our amended definition. But let me start with what happens at each floor first. Before I do that, there's two really important points I want to make. One is in writing, Scriven talked about that, yes, there was work happening on each of the floors, but that it all was important and necessary and equally important. Right. And so he wanted to make sure and sort of push back on the idea that one floor was sort of more important than the other because he didn't see it that way. Right. He wasn't privileging one floor over the other. The other thing he talked about was the importance of stairs, which you see in this photo as well. Right. And it's because he talked about, you need folks being able who are doing work at each of the floors and the stuff that's going on there. And you need folks who are able to move between floors, right? And it's all of that work together that really continues to build the evaluation building, right? The sort of foundations in all of our work, right? Evaluation as a discipline and as a transdiscipline. So, okay, now that I've given those two caveats, I'm going to start with the fourth floor and work my way down. So the fourth floor, or the top floor, is where metatheoretical work happens. And so this metatheoretical work generates the blueprints, if you will, for the field. So these blueprints cover things like why merit, worth, or significance are types of evaluative judgments that one makes. It includes things like arguments for where the evaluation building sits in relation to other buildings, right? It also includes work that folks have done on the moral and axiological dimensions of the field, right? So it's sort of this metatheoretical work that's happening that are sort of building the blueprints, right? The third floor is devoted to theoretical work. And this theoretical work includes, for example, work on evaluation theories, models, approaches, right? It also includes work on the concept of values and evaluation, and it's varied and sometimes different definitions appearing in the evaluation scholarship. The second floor is where those in the field interested in developing instruments or methods or techniques do their work, right? So for example, people who are doing work on evaluation criteria, right, would fit here, right? What are the criteria we ought to use? What are criteria frameworks we might use? Folks who are pushing forward ideas around evaluation synthesis methods. This is where their work sits, right? So rubrics, for instance, and the work Jane Davidson's been doing around that is an example of a synthesis method, right? This is where it sort of happens. And also ideas about, for instance, what values ought to guide evaluation practice. Those are the kinds of things that happen here. And then the ground floor, the first floor, is where practitioners engage in applied work. And so it's here, for example, where practitioners take the work that's been done on other floors and they test it out in practice. And, you know, part of what they're doing is trying to understand its usefulness or its limits. And ideally, right, so this is where you start to understand you need people who can move between floors. Ideally, they're sharing out, right, in ways that push work on the other floors forward, right? And so, you know, it's not just sort of knowledge coming, you know, down the steps, right? It's also knowledge going back up too, right? And work going back up, right? And so, you know, for instance, you know, so it involves sort of practitioners sort of sharing back up, right? Also work on theory practice connections, for instance, is happening here, right? Those kinds of studies and things like that, right? So giving you sort of a brief overview on what sort of happens on each floor. So now I just want to briefly talk about the changes we made to the evaluation building as a result of our amended definition. And there are two critical changes that I want to highlight for you today that are a result of our definition. The first is that it provides the backing needed to completely renovate the evaluation building. And we chose to renovate it instead of tear it down and build anew. And we say this in the chapter. So for example, we use this definition as backing to change the name to the evaluation building, which is what you see here, right? In the introduction to the evaluation thesaurus, it was called the Great House of Evaluation. And so in sort of describing that, he says, he calls it, quote, it's like the Great House of Plantation Days, end quote. And as Khalil and I say in the chapter, a metaphor, right, that has roots to slavery, to servitude, racism, is not one that we will endorse, but certainly one that we don't think the field will or should endorse, right? So we just from the get-go change the metaphor in a way that that got rid of that connotation and that connection. The second critical implication of this amended definition is that it makes explicit that big E ethics must be a part of work happening on each floor. And so in this revised evaluation building, it makes transparent that there are ethical dimensions that have to be considered in work that's occurring at each of the floors. So for this reason, we decided to put ethics in here and show it as the insulation in the building. So you see a little bit here, but it's these dotted lines, right? And so, you know, we wanted it to surround each floor, you know, each room within a particular floor. And as we argue in this chapter, adding the ethical insulation means that there's actually much more work to do. And we give some ideas about, you know, that in the chapter. So it's also why we chose a visual that is not done, right? So like if you look at the picture, it's like in, you know, there's some things there you can see it, but you can also see like there's still renovations that are happening, right? And so, you know, here again is our amended definition. We do not, and we say this in the chapter, we do not anticipate that everyone will agree with our argument. That's the nature of things. And we also believe critique is really important and dialogue is really important. So, but that said, whichever side you're on, what we asked is that folks remain open to our arguments and honestly consider them. And we're hopeful that even a few will decide to take up some of the necessary and needed next work to be able to push these ideas forward. So With that, I will say thank you. I suspect you all have questions or thoughts, those kinds of things. Love to hear them. And this is also how you can connect with me. In a second, I'll put in the chat both not just my email address, but Khalil's, as well as where you can find a copy of this PowerPoint if you want it.
And just a reminder, you can raise your hand if you have questions, or I see some questions going into the chat. That works as well. And I'm also going to throw in some links into the chat where you can, a couple people have asked about this being recorded. It is recorded. It will be on our Evaluation Café website in a couple of days. So I'm going to put that link in there where you can see our upcoming presentations and our past recordings. And I'll also put a link to our mailing list. And then I'll get out of here and let Bianca answer questions.
Yeah, so maybe just go in the order that I see them in. So I see Michael's question first. So Michael Harner asks, Bianca, what do you think Michael would say in response to the new definition you're putting forward? Oh, that's a good question. I don't think he'd have a problem with the ethically informed piece, because he actually talks in the introduction about ethics sort of being, I think he calls it like a final frontier, and like one that hasn't fully been kind of explored yet and sort of pushed forward. And so I suspect he was sort of, I think he had to bound what he was trying to do in the introduction, but also foreshadow some things that he thought was really important. I don't know how he would feel about the addition of a fourth type of judgment. Khalil and I really went back and forth about what to call that fourth type of judgment. And we settled on value, recognizing that the field uses that term lots of different ways and things like that. But, and the reason I say that is because we didn't use his same technique for adding the fourth type. So, Michael, in his writing, and certainly in the classes I took, he was a big fan of the Oxford English Dictionary. And it's one of the first things he taught us was to go find it and use it. And so, his definition of evaluation comes from that. And he hasn't been shy about doing that. And so unlike him, we didn't go to the Oxford English Dictionary to add the fourth dimension. We went to the evaluation literature to add the fourth type of judgment. And so, I think he'd understand that, but I also think he'd push back on the fact that it wasn't tied to the Oxford English Dictionary. That's my sense of things. Yeah. And let me, as I'm sharing, let me stop sharing my screen. That might be helpful too. And it'll let me see the
Bianca,
questions a little bit better. Yeah.
Can I follow up and just ask you? Because when I saw you,
Yeah.
when I would have pushed back and asked you why value isn't incorporated into merit. I mean, isn't that really what it is? If it's meritorious, it shows that it meets our value expectations. That's what we build into the criteria of merit is our values. So that's really where I thought that he might push back, at least from my thinking. But I'd really like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, we talk about this in the book, or in the chapter. So the short answer is, I think in theory, yes, right? We would love it to be part of merit. In practice, it's not. And in fact, so for instance, the example we give in the chapter is you could use the DAC criteria to center your evaluation, to think about which aspects of merit, worth, and significance you're gonna bear down on in evaluation. And you could do an entire evaluation using those criteria and never consider equity. And so what we were trying to do, part of what we were trying to do is say, we think that this is critically important for any evaluation to consider. And the fact that we've just been hiding it in things isn't getting us closer to doing that in practice. I think it's happening in pockets. I don't think it's happening. In fact, I know it's not happening across the board, right? And so that's our response, right? Like, yeah, in theory it should, but in practice it's not. And so, it means we need to be a little bit more explicit in the same way we're being explicit about ethically informed being in there, right? Work has changed enough, and we've had enough time with practice to see that we need more explicitness around some of these things. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Okay. Let me see. Daniela. Hi, Daniela. Thank you. Very thought-provoking. I'm curious about the order of the floors in the evaluation building. Could you talk a bit about what makes applied work the foundation of the building? Yeah, so I'll talk about my view on that. I can't tell you, and he doesn't describe why he put the order that he did. So, I'll just share my own view on that. My own view on that is, it's not that I don't think metatheoretical work is important. It's not that I don't think theoretical work is important. It's not that I don't think work around methods and tools and all that kind of stuff is important. But we are a practice-based field, right? We are a practical field. And if it doesn't work in practice, or things aren't, there's a disconnect between what's happening on the ground floor and what's happening on other floors, right? That's problematic. And so I think about practice being on the ground floor as both a recognition that we are a practice-based discipline, and also recognizing that there really is, I think if you think about the floors as a continuum, right? And so you've got the sort of ground, I know I'm messing with the metaphor a little bit, but you've got the ground as like one, practice as one anchor, and then metatheoretical work as another anchor, right? In theory, you should have connections between those two and things happening at all places along that continuum, right? And so I think it's also another way to sort of think about what are the anchors on a continuum that one might use. So. Dana, love this and can't wait to read the full paper. I'm curious about your thoughts about systematic inquiry and how you see this fitting into Gullickson's paper on defining the whole elephant. Yeah, so I think it fits well with Amy's paper. This definition is definitely grounded in the logic of evaluation, and the whole elephant is really unpacking that, I think, in a really practical kind of way. And so I think there's a clear connection there. And I would argue Amy's work on defining the whole elephant is obviously it's housed in the evaluation building, right? Systematic inquiry. So this is what I'd say to that. I don't think there's anyone who's doing really good evaluation work that wouldn't argue that what they're doing is systematic. What I sometimes think about is sometimes people use the word systematic to mean rigorous, and rigorous in a particular kind of sense. And so I do think we have to be careful about that, right? That particular piece. But I would argue that that all really good evaluation is systematic. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but there you go. Let's see. Okay, so I'm pretty stuffle beam position. Equity and fairness as dimensions of merit quality. Can you say more about how you see it as a distinct type of judgment? So I don't know if this. Oh yeah,
Bianca, I'm just going to cut you off. That was my question. It's Lori in the room, and I added later that your response to Michael Harner actually answered my question as well. Though it was exactly I had exactly the same question. You answered it beautifully, so you don't need to. You can take someone else's.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. How can we access the presentation slides to the email? Yeah, so I'll put it in again. The PowerPoint is, I've been using OSF quite a bit for my work. And so the paper is not up there because, the paper or the chapters in the book. But what is up there is the PowerPoint from today and the country of the mind map and the evaluation building, because those are ours and all that. So yeah, and thanks for putting in the link to the book. I'm super excited about it. I've seen the other chapters and the table of contents and stuff, and I think it's just going to be a really great book. So
Okay, thank you so much, Bianca. And I think double check me, but I think we've answered all the questions. Yep, I'm just checking again. But I appreciate all of you for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you at our next Eval Cafe. On March 13th, we're going to be joined by AEA President Felicia Bohannon. That will be actually an in-person only event, but we will have the recording available afterwards. So you can find information about that at wmich.edu. /evaluation/cafe. So if you are in the area or you want to come out for lunch and a great presentation, you know where to find us. And thank you so much, Bianca. We really appreciate it.
yeah, thanks again. It was really lovely to be here.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
You too. Bye, everyone.